Hello there, AP Environmental Science class. Welcome to part one of my lecture on Chapter 4, Biodiversity and Evolution. As has been the case the past couple of chapters, there are about 40 slides or so. So we'll do about 20 slides in part one and about 20 slides or so in part two. So once again, this is part one, Chapter 4, Biodiversity and Evolution. All right, we start off with a core case study talking about why amphibians are vanishing. Frogs are becoming extinct at 10,000 times their normal historical rates of becoming extinct. Some of the reasons: skin secretions are the source of many valuable pharmaceutical products. So the frogs, the amphibians, are being hunted. Unfortunately, they play an important economic roles in their communities. So by hunting them and by them becoming extinct, obviously we're messing with the biodiversity. Amphibians are also very sensitive biological indicators. Why is that? Well, number one, they breathe through their skin, so their entire body is taking in, right, any pollution, any chemicals that may be in their environment. Number two, amphibians have two distinct life cycles, right? They live in the water, and then they come out on land. So amphibians actually can help us with water pollution and air pollution or pollution on land, right? Because their life cycles have them in both of those environments. So amphibians are very important. Again, they're kind of on the front lines. When you see your amphibians dying out or disappearing, you know you have problems with your ecosystem, usually pollution problems with your ecosystem. So more on that a little bit later on. First things first, what are the major types of life on planet Earth? Well, we classify life based on cell structure. We have prokaryotic cells. Those are your simplest cells, your bacterial cells. They have no distinct nucleus or internal parts enclosed by membranes. And then we have our eukaryotic cells. These are all non-bacterial organisms, like the cells that we have, and they're going to have a nucleus and they're going to have internal parts enclosed by membranes. What are species? They are a group of living organisms with characteristics that distinguish it from other groups of organisms. However, they also must be able to sexually reproduce with another similar individual and produce a fertile offspring. If they can't produce a fertile offspring, then they're technically not species. So again, species, living organisms with the same characteristics, right, that differentiate it from other groups, but they also must be able to sexually reproduce a fertile offspring together to be officially classified as a species. All right, looking at our two types of cells here. Again, on the left, your prokaryotic cells. Again, no nucleus, no internal organs or organelles in this case. On the right, we have your eukaryotic cell, right? These have your nucleus, these have your Golgi apparatus, and all those other, organelles inside some sort of membrane. So again, two different types of cells here. I know most of you are familiar with this from biology. We have an estimated 7 to 10 million species on planet Earth, but only about 2 million of those have been identified. So the rest, again, are just estimates here. Half of those 2 million identified species are actually insects. So when they say insects run the world, they absolutely run the world. They've been here long before us, and I have a feeling they may be here long after us as well. So again, about half of those 2 million species that have been identified are identified as insects. And insects, obviously, pollination, a vital ecosystem service performed by those insects. So if those insects die out, we could have big problems, right? Also, insect species reproduce rapidly, and this can produce new genetic traits. And this, unfortunately, one of the issues is pesticide resistance when it comes to insects. And we'll talk more about this in a subsequent chapter when we talk about food production. But something to think about, right? You have a bunch of these insects on a corn plant, right? And you spray pesticide to kill the insects. Well, of course, a couple of them have a mutation that allows them to live, right? So a couple of them make it through because they reproduce so rapidly. After only a couple of generations, which could really be a couple of months, maybe a year or two, your insects are now resistant to that pesticide. So what we're going to talk about in a subsequent chapter is how you want to bring in natural predators, because what happens is when you have a natural predator like a bird, right, that eats the particular insect, when the insect mutates and evolves to deal with the predator, well, the predator evolves as well to deal with the insect. So the predator still eats the insect. So you have almost like an arms race where the insect and the predator-prey relationship is what it's called, is actually they're actually together and evolving together, and therefore you can use natural ways to get rid of your insects much better than using synthetic pesticides. So again, something we'll talk about in a couple of chapters. So what is biodiversity and why is it important? Well, biodiversity is just that. It's a diversity of life on planet Earth. And the more biodiversity we have, as we'll talk in this chapter and in subsequent chapters, the more healthy your ecosystem is going to be. So we have a couple of things. So a couple of diversities that we have. The first are known as species diversity, right? Just the difference of species out there. And this includes species richness and species evenness. So species richness is the amount of species in a particular area. So how many species do we have in a region, right? If we have 50 different species, then that area would be more rich than, let's say, an ecosystem that only has 25 different species. Species evenness is how many of those individual species are there, or population of species. So for instance, if we have 75 rabbits and one wolf in an ecosystem, that wouldn't be very even, right? If we had 50 rabbits and 50 wolves, that would be more of species evenness. So species evenness is the evenness of the amount of each species. Species richness is talking about how many different species we have in an ecosystem. Genetic diversity is the variety of genes in a population or species. And then we have ecosystem diversity, different biomes, right? Regions with distinct climates and species. I would argue plants and animals living here in Ardsley may not be able to survive up at the North Pole, right? They have their own ecosystem up there and their own species. So again, things we'll think about as we go through the course. So forests, for instance, have a lot of biodiversity. Why? Because they have a core habitat and an edge habitat, right? In the core, in the middle of the forest, you're going to have different creatures, different plants living than you would have along the edges of forest, right? So the edge effect, conditions different from the forest interior, such as temperature, light, humidity, etc. Unfortunately, as forests are fragmented, meaning as we cut them down, there is less core habitat and more edge habitat, right? You have this big forest, then we cut a section here up to build a home. We cut another section down to build a home. Now you have a lot more edge, but you've taken away that core habitat, right? So again, this is things that reduce our biodiversity. So as forests are fragmented, less core, more edge. Ecotone is just a transitional area where two different ecosystems merge. We also have functional diversity. This is the variety of processes that occur within an ecosystem, right? So we have energy flow, we have matter cycling, right? Some ecosystems are better at the carbon cycle, some ecosystems might be better with the water cycle, etc. So again, we have this functional diversity. What are the advantages of biologically diverse ecosystems? They produce more plant biomass to support a greater number of consumer species, right? This is that higher NPP we were talking about in the previous chapter. They also contain species traits that enable them to adapt to changing environmental conditions. Usually when you have a good ecosystem with a lot of biodiversity, they can handle changes to the environment better than an ecosystem that doesn't have biodiversity. So again, just kind of looking at a chart here, the major components of Earth's biodiversity. Again, there's the functional, the different types of biological and chemical processes that happen. Then we have our genetic diversity, again, the variety of genes. You have your species diversity that we spoke about, right? And then you have your ecological diversity, or the variety of terrestrial and aquatic ecosystems we have out there. So this is just a picture of a community structure. You'll notice the tropical rainforest, plants are much higher, right? Different types of trees. In a coniferous forest, we're going to be dealing with pine trees mainly. Deciduous forest, right? Trees are a little shorter than in the tropical rainforest. Here's your thorn forest and your prairies, your shortgrass prairies, etc. Again, each community here, each different biome is going to have different plants, different animals, different biodiversity in those different areas. And again, we're lucky we have these different communities of structure out there, because again, this just increases Earth's biodiversity. You're going to have different plants and animals living in the desert than you're going to have in a tropical rainforest. And just again, to show you the major biomes we have here across the United States, we're actually going to do a whole unit on terrestrial biomes coming up in a couple of weeks. But you'll notice, again, deciduous forest out near we are. Here's Baltimore, obviously, here Ardsley, just a little north of that. Then we have our grasslands, our coniferous forests, deserts, more coniferous forest and the coastal chaparral and scrub biome out in California, out in the western states. So again, in each of these areas, you're going to have different plants, different animals, right? A lot of biodiversity. If we had all deciduous forests, there wouldn't be as much biodiversity as we have out there because, again, we have all these different biomes. So something we'll talk about a little bit more a little bit later on in the course. So what role do species play in their ecosystem? So each species is going to play a specific ecological role called a niche or a niche. You can call it either way. All right, this includes everything that affects survival and reproduction: water, space, sunlight, food, temperature, etc. Two types of species out there. We have a generalist species, which has a broad niche, which means a wide range of tolerances. I would argue that us human beings are a generalist species. We can generally live anywhere, right? That's what that means. Specialist species means you have a narrow niche or a narrow niche, which means a narrow range of tolerances. So think about the panda bear, right? The panda can only live where there's bamboo, right? Which is in certain areas in Asia. The bamboo, the panda can't live everywhere, right? It generally can't live. It's a specialist species, and so it can only live in a certain area. And this is kind of what we're looking at here. Here's your panda with a narrow niche. Here's a raccoon, which is a generalist species. Again, has a much longer, a much wider niche here, which means it can live in more places, and it can withstand extinction a lot better as well compared to specialist species, right? Because in a specialist species, if you lose that ecosystem, that species becomes extinct. A generalist species could potentially live in different types of ecosystems, and so they have a better chance of surviving and reproducing, et cetera, et cetera. So things to think about, all right, as we go through the course. Four major ecosystem roles for species. We have native species, which normally live and thrive in that particular ecosystem. We have non-native or invasive species, which migrate or are accidentally introduced to an ecosystem, most of the time for negative results, even though I guess every now and then there could be a positive. We have an indicator species, that's like the amphibians we talked about at the beginning of this lecture, provide early warnings of environmental changes. And then we have something called keystone species, which have a large effect on the types and abundance of other species in an ecosystem. A keystone species, I guess you could kind of think of the king species, right, in the ecosystem. Kind of what it does kind of controls what the other species end up doing. And a case study is our American alligator down in the Florida Everglades. This is a keystone species that almost went extinct. Again, it lives in subtropical wetland ecosystems. They dig gator holes that hold fresh water, serve as a refuge for aquatic life. In the 1930s, they were hunted for sport meat and skin. 1967, added to the endangered species list. 10 years later, 1977, an impressive comeback. And now today we got more than 1 million alligators living down in the Florida area. So what does this mean? In this course, we talk a lot about negatives, right? A lot about the bad things that are going on out there in the environment. However, there are a bunch of positives as well. And every time there's a positive, I want to point that out. Here is a positive, right? We as human beings knew something. 1967, we knew things were messed up, right? So we added the alligator to the endangered species list, which offered it protection, right? And other things that allowed people not to kill it. And there we go, 10 years later, and that protection worked. And now, bravo, positive, the alligators come back. So the point is, it's not all lost, guys. That's why this course is here. It's for you guys now as you guys move on into college and into the workforce, right? We can change things, right? And here is a point. It can be changed. It was alligators were headed towards extinction. We realized it. We protected them. And now 1 million alligators today living in Florida. So bravo to us. Again, we have a lot more work to do, but there are some positives out there. And there it is. Our good old friend, the American alligator. All right, back to that cause of the amphibian declines. Just real quick, Science Focus 4.1. Just again, talking about the decline and disappearance of not only amphibians, but again, reptiles like alligators. Parasites, viral and fungal diseases could do this. Habitat loss and fragmentation. Higher levels of UV radiation actually hurt, especially the amphibians. Pollution, climate change, overhunting all lead to the decline and the disappearance of our reptiles and our amphibians. All right, so First part of this chapter talked about biodiversity. Second part is going to talk about evolution. So make sure to tune back in for part 2 of my lecture on chapter 4. And as always, thanks for listening.